Now, if you'll recall, last time we discussed how you should go about throwing shells at your target. But what are you actually throwing at these targets? That will be today's topic. Shell types. We'll be going over shells piece by piece. They shouldn't take too long, so let's get started. Firstly, high explosive, or HE in short. The most common shell on larger caliber guns, as it comes by default with any new ship. High explosive shells are thin-walled projectiles filled to the brim with a high explosive charge, which detonates as soon as the shell comes into contact with an obstacle. This is most suitable against light-skinned targets, which are mostly smaller coastal vessels. It is also useful for knocking out lightly armored gun mounts and creating holes in the sides of ships if their filler is large enough. They are also quite the fire starters, so while they might not be able to penetrate armor, they're still capable at destroying exposed modules, creating fires and causing breaches. Next is base fuse high explosive, or HEBF for short. Incredibly similar to regular high explosive, but this shell has a very mild penetrating capability while still retaining a similar explosive charge. This shell is mostly found in the German Navy, unless I missed some. There is a risk of over-penetrating very small targets, such as coastal vessels, as the fuses on these shells are, as the name implies, at the base of the shell as compared to being on the nose, and are far less sensitive. Up next, we have High Explosive Variable Time Fuse, or HEVT, a dual-purpose shell that detonates on proximity of aircraft, but also functions as a regular high explosive shell against surface targets. There are very few cases where you wouldn't take this over regular high explosive due to the HEVT having less explosive filler, but usually it is the preferred high explosive type. And lastly, for the pure high explosive types, High Explosive Time Fuse, which is abbreviated to HETF, the manual counterpart to HEVT. This shell is an anti-air shell, but less effective in that role and also less effective in the anti-ship role. The fuse accuracy, meaning the distance at which the shell will actually detonate, is dependent on crew skills, and those can be rather finicky. And I must also address, recently there has been a rumor going around that the High Explosive Time Fuse shell is a more effective shell in the anti-shipping role than high explosive is. This is just a straight up lie. Sure, some statistic is higher on it than the regular high explosive, but the hoops you have to jump through to actually meaningfully hit a target with high explosive time fuse shells is just plain stupid. Firstly, you have to over-adjust the range by several hundred meters, meaning that you can only do that with the realistic aiming system. Then you have to drastically aim below the target, which sure you can still do, but why go through all of that effort when you can just switch to regular high explosive and be just as effective? So whenever you hear somebody say, oh, use high explosive time fuse against ships, do not listen to them, they do not know what they're talking about. Now, the more attentive among you may have noticed that when I talked about the last shell type, I said the last pure high explosive shell type. That's because there's this shell, shrapnel shells. They're kind of the dishonorable mention of the high explosive category. You only really see them on a few ships, like the Russian Frunze and the British steam gunboats and the reserve destroyer Churchill. Shrapnel shells are generally similar to regular high explosive shells, but with higher fragmentation counts, which is more damaging to open crew locations. The increase in damage does of course come at the cost of penetration, but against the targets you'll be using shrapnel against you usually don't need much penetration to begin with. As a transitional shell of sorts, we have semi-armor piercing, or SAP for short. This shell is roughly a combination between high explosive and armor piercing, getting the best of both worlds, or the worst, depending on the ship and gun. Semi-armor piercing usually has a large bursting charge, while still retaining a large amount of penetration. It's an excellent shell type for when regular high explosive wouldn't cut it, but armor piercing would be overkill. There are a few variations on the shell, like SAP CBC, which gains more penetration. And then there's the American Common and Special Common shells, which, for as far as I know, are just SAP and SAP CBC. And then there's armor piercing, or AP. There are various shell types in this category, like APHE-BC, APC, or APC-BC. You don't really need to know the distinction between these shell types, as they all perform the same role. They prioritize penetration over bursting charge. It's the choice for when you have to hit internal components, be they engines or ammo storage. Semi-armor piercing on the bigger guns like 12 and 14 inch guns usually outshines this shell, But on the smaller guns where one might not have semi-armor piercing, regular box standard AP does its job. Armor piercing also has the benefit of being able to travel further into the ship and go through thicker armor than semi-armor piercing, making it the shell choice for marksmen. Now, you all know that I can't ignore the coastal fleet either. But for them it's pretty much the same. Their larger caliber cannons have the same shell choices. But when it comes to their automatic guns, their belts usually have a combination of just armor piercing or just high explosive, or something along those lines. In general, the high explosive belts do more damage but cannot penetrate any armor, while the armor piercing belts do less damage per shell hit but can travel through multiple hull compartments, thus being more effective against bow-on targets. There isn't much else to mention, it's really that simple, shell types aren't that difficult. To summarize, high explosive does more damage, armor piercing has the most penetration, and semi-armor piercing is a mixture of both. When it comes to the anti-air shell types, high explosive variable time fuse is preferred as it's arguably the best shell type in the game. The regular high explosive time fuse shell isn't too bad in the anti-air role, just not as reliable. Any more questions?
Why do people think HETF is better than regular HE?
I expected this question, and it's a pet peeve of mine that people think this and spread this misinformation. It started with people using large caliber guns on coastal vessels, specifically the German barges, and seeing that when these shells detonated close to a target, the target got sprayed in shrapnel. They then came to the conclusion that this shrapnel was superior in count to regular high explosive, but they failed to notice that this fragmentation from shells that prematurely detonate do little damage, while a direct hit with regular high explosive would have inflicted so much more damage than those shrapnel fragments. And then you have the cases where they believe that the hull breaks they've achieved on enemies when they do miraculously directly impact the target wouldn't have been possible with regular high explosive shells, which is just plain wrong. Look, I won't stop you from using high explosive time fuse shells as your main shell choice, but don't any of you dare come crying to me when you get outgunned by the same vessel using regular high explosive. Anything else? No? Well then, be on your way and enjoy the rest of your day.